Widowed mother of 9 thought nobody would want her. A wealthy rancher paid her debt. The deed was on the table when I got there. Not sitting neat, the way a man sets something down deliberate. Crumpled at one corner like it had been held too tight too many times. There was a coffee ring on it, dried brown, and a smear of something that might have been flour or might have been ash. The lamp on the table was turned low, oil running short, I figured, and the light it threw was yellowish and thin. And in that light, Nora Calloway sat with her hands flat on either side of that deed like she was trying to hold it still. Like if she let go it might float away and take everything with it. I'd knocked, she'd said come in. That was the whole of the welcome. I'd ridden 3 miles in October cold to get there, and I hadn't told anybody I was coming. Not her. Not my foreman, Cal. Nobody. I just saddled the gray at first light and rode west on the flats toward the Calloway quarter section, which was not much of a quarter section and getting smaller in every practical sense by the day. I told myself I was going to look at a fence line. I don't know who I thought I was fooling. She didn't look up right away. She was reading something, or maybe she was just staring at the page and not reading anything at all. One of her children, I didn't know their names yet, not all of them, was asleep in a chair by the stove. Small, couldn't have been more than 3. The stove was going but not hot, just keeping the chill off, and the kitchen smelled of old wood smoke and something boiled down to not much. I took my hat off. I didn't know what to say. I am not a man who struggles for words because I am not a man who uses many of them, but standing in that kitchen, I felt the specific dumbness of a man who knows he has come somewhere with a purpose he can't quite name out loud. She looked up. Nora Calloway was, I'll tell you what she was. She was 38 years old, and she looked like a woman who had been 38 years old for a long time. Not old, not worn out, but used up in the particular way of a person who has not stopped moving since before they were grown. Her hair was dark, going gray at the temple, and it was pinned but barely, a few pieces loose around her face. Her eyes were the color of creek water in November, clear and cold and deep in a way you don't get to the bottom of quick. She said, "Mr. Aldous, you're a ways from home." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I don't have coffee made." I said, "I didn't come for coffee." She looked at me a moment, then she looked back down at the deed. She set one hand on top of it, flat, the way you'd set a hand on a Bible. She said, "I know why you came." I said, "You do." She said, "Harlan Veitch sent you." I said, "No." I said Harlan Veitch had nothing to do with me being there, and that if she'd heard otherwise, she'd heard wrong. Harlan Veitch was the man who held the note on her property, who had been holding it tighter every month since her husband Tom died, who had made 2 trips out to this house in the past 6 weeks to talk about what he called arrangements. I knew what his arrangements looked like. I'd seen them before. She studied me. She had a way of looking at a man. I noticed it that first morning, and I never stopped noticing it, like she was measuring something that wasn't his size or his face, like she was looking for the thing underneath. She said, "Then why did you come?" And I didn't have a good answer for that, not one I could say plain. I was 54 years old, and I had 12,000 acres and no wife and no children and a house that echoed when I walked through it. And I had watched Tom Calloway's widow for 8 months from a distance, and I had done nothing because a man like me doesn't do things like that, doesn't presume, doesn't walk up to a woman drowning in grief and children and debt and say something useless. And then one morning I woke up and I thought, she's going to lose that land. She's going to lose it to Harlan Veitch, who will sell the timber rights and run a few head on it and not care that 9 children grew up there, and Nora Calloway will have nowhere to go and nothing to go there with. I said I'd like to look at the deed. She pulled her hand off it like it burned her. Then she pushed it across the table to me. I read it. I already knew most of what it said. The note was $460, which doesn't sound like much now, but was enough then to swallow a woman whole. Tom had borrowed against the land twice, once for a bad year and once for a horse that broke a leg 3 days after he paid for it, and the interest had been climbing and there had been a missed payment in spring, and now Veitch had filed with the county and the paper said she had 30 days. She had 12 of them left. I set the deed back down. I looked at the child asleep in the chair. It had 1 shoe on and 1 shoe off. The bare foot was tucked up under it for warmth. I said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'd like to help you." She said, "I'm not a charity case." I said, "I know that." She said, "And I'm not looking for a husband." I said, "I'm not offering to be one." That landed between us and sat there. The stove ticked. The child shifted in the chair without waking. Outside, somewhere past the window, one of the older ones was doing something in the yard. I could hear boots on frozen ground, something being dragged. She said, "You have 12,000 acres. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And you want to pay off a dead man's debt out of the goodness of your heart." I said, "I want to pay off that note because Harlan Veitch doesn't deserve this land and you do." I said it plain, without dressing it up, because I am not a man who dresses things up, and she struck me as a woman who'd have seen through it anyway. She looked at me a long time, not like she was deciding whether to trust me, more like she was tired enough that even deciding felt like a weight she hadn't budgeted for. She said, "What do you want for it?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Men don't do things for nothing." I said, "I'm not doing it for nothing." I said that I had a proposition if she wanted to hear it. Not a charity proposition and not a husband proposition, a work proposition. She waited. I told her. I had 12,000 acres and one house and a crew of 11 men, and not one person who knew how to run a house or keep a kitchen or manage what a house actually needs to keep running. I had been eating food cooked by a man named Gus who had one good dish and made it 4 days out of 7. I had a library that nobody read and rooms that nobody used, and a yard that a dog had mostly taken over. I said that if she was willing to come manage the house, her and the children, all 9 of them, I would pay her a wage, and I would settle the note, and the children would have room and food, and she would have a place that wasn't going to be taken out from under her by a man like Veitch. She said, "You'd take 9 children into your house." I said I'd thought about it. She said the oldest is 17, and the youngest is 2. I said I have space. She said they make noise, they break things. The twins fight from the time they get up to the time they go to sleep and sometimes through the night. I said I've been alone in a quiet house for 11 years. I think I can stand some noise. Something shifted in her face then, not softening exactly, more like something that had been braced let go a little. She said, "You'd have to give me time to think." I said, "You've got 12 days. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The corner of her mouth moved and she looked down at the deed and then back up at me, and the almost smile was gone, but something else was there in its place. I couldn't have named it. I can name it now. It was the look of a woman who has been holding something alone for so long that the idea of someone else putting a hand on it, not taking it, just helping hold it, is almost too much to receive. I put my hat back on. I said, "You think on it." She said she would. I walked out into the October cold and found my gray horse where I'd tied him and rode back east across the flats and didn't look back, because looking back would have been the wrong thing. Let me tell you about the 12,000 acres before I tell you the rest. I came to that land when I was 23. Came to it broke and with bad boots and one horse that wasn't much and a letter from a man in Cheyenne who owed my father a favor. The letter was for a job as a hand on a ranch that turned out to be mostly rocks and scrub and a creek that ran dry by July. I worked it 3 years for a man named Durst who paid me just enough to keep me and not enough to leave. When Durst died, Hart, middle of branding season, fell right off the fence post he'd been sitting on. I found out he'd left the whole thing to a nephew in Ohio who had never seen it and didn't want to. I borrowed money from the man in Cheyenne who'd given me the letter. Borrowed every dollar I could get and then borrowed more. Paid Durst's nephew what the land was worth and then spent the next 30 years making it worth more. I don't say that to brag. I say it because a man's land is the thing he poured himself into, and when you pour that much into something, you don't have much left for the other things. I had been engaged once to a woman named Patricia who had a laugh like water over rocks and who left after 2 years because she said the ranch would always come before her, and she was right. I had thought about other women over the years, had been to town, had done what a man does when he's lonely and there's a woman willing, but I hadn't loved anyone. I'm not sure I knew I was capable of it at 54. I thought that part of me had maybe dried up the way that creek had, gone underground somewhere past finding. The morning I rode to Nora Calloway's kitchen, I had not planned it. I had been up since 3 with a sick heifer, and by 5 the heifer was fine, and by 6 I was standing in my own kitchen, which was cold, because Gus didn't start the stove until 7, and I was thinking about nothing in particular, and then I was thinking about her. Not anything romantic, not even anything soft. I was thinking about the debt, about Veitch's face the week before in the feed store when he'd talked about that property like he was already measuring it for what he'd take out of it. And something in me had gone hard and quiet the way it goes when I've made a decision before I've made a decision. I can tell you now, sitting here with the better part of my life behind me, what that morning was. It was the last morning of one kind of life and the first morning of another, and I rode through it without knowing which it was, the way you always do. She came on a Wednesday, 11 days after I'd sat in her kitchen. I didn't know she was coming Wednesday. I told her to think on it, and I hadn't sent word back, and she hadn't sent word to me, and I'd spent 11 days wondering if I'd said something wrong, or if she'd found another way out, or if she'd just decided the whole thing was too strange to touch. Cal, my foreman, had noticed I was distracted. He hadn't said anything. Cal was not a man who said unnecessary things, which is one of the reasons I'd kept him 20 years. But he'd given me a look once or twice that I understood. It was after dinner, maybe 7 o'clock, and I was in the barn checking on a mare that had been off her feed when I heard the wagon. Not the sound of a man's wagon. There's a difference in how hard they drive it, in the line they take through a gate. This was careful, deliberate, a woman's hand on the reins. I came out of the barn and the wagon was already in the yard. It was a tired wagon, one of the wheels wrapped in rawhide where the iron had cracked, and it was loaded with everything a family of 10 could fit, which is a great deal when you think about it and not very much when you see it. Bedding, a trunk, boxes of kitchen things, and children. They came off that wagon like a tide going out. All 9 of them, different sizes, some of them half asleep and some of them wide awake and looking at my house and my barn and my yard with the particular intensity that children have when they know their world has changed. The 2-year-old, that was Lily, I learned later, was asleep against the oldest girl's shoulder, her mouth open, completely untroubled by any of it. The oldest girl was 17, and her name was Celia, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of looking at things like she was measuring them. Nora climbed down from the wagon seat herself. She didn't wait for help, which I would learn was not stubbornness. Well, it was a little bit stubbornness, but mostly just how she moved through the world. She had a coat on that was too light for October, and her hair was down against the cold. She looked at me across the yard. She said, "I thought on it." I said, "I can see that." She said, "I have conditions." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The children's rooms are their own. I'll manage the house, but I'll do it my way. I won't be treated like a servant in front of my children. I'll take a wage that's real, not charity dressed as a wage." She stopped, she looked at the house, then back at me. She said, "Nobody here treats us like we're less than what we are." I said, "Mrs. Calloway, if any man on this property treats you or your children as less than what you are, he'll be gone before the sun goes down on the same day. You have my word on that." She looked at me again with that measuring look. Then she nodded, once, like that was settled. She turned back to the wagon and started directing children, and I will tell you it was something to watch. She moved through those 9 kids the way a good hand moves through a herd, knowing which ones needed a word, and which ones needed a hand, and which ones just needed to be pointed in a direction and left to go. The twins, Robert and Ray, 11 years old and built like matched fence posts, she put to work unloading before they could think about getting into anything. The older boys she sent to find Cal and ask about where to put the horses. Celia she gave the baby and a direction toward the house. The younger ones she gathered close and walked toward the door herself. I stood in my yard and watched, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Felt it somewhere in the chest. The warmth of a house being used for what a house is for. I paid the note the next morning. Rode into town, went to the county office, laid the money on the clerk's desk. The clerk, a young man named Fenster who always looked mildly alarmed by things, counted it twice and gave me the receipt. I rode to Vache's office after and gave him a copy. Vache was a man in his 50s who had made money the way some men do, not by building anything, but by waiting for men who had built things to stumble. He had thick hands and a way of leaning back in his chair that was meant to make you feel like you were coming to him with a favor always. He looked at the receipt. Then he looked at me. He said, "You're paying Calloway's note." I said, "That's right." He said, "You sweet on the widow." I didn't hit him, I thought about it. I said, "Harlan, the note is cleared and the land is hers. If you've got a problem with that, you can take it to somebody who gives a damn what you think." Then I put my hat on and walked out. I don't say that story to make myself look good. I say it because the ride back from town that morning was the first morning in a long time I felt like I'd done the exact right thing in the exact right way. The gray was moving well under me, and the sky had come up clear and cold, and I could smell the grass turning, and somewhere ahead of me 12,000 acres were going about the work of being a ranch. And somewhere in the middle of all that a woman with 9 children was learning where things were kept. The early weeks were not easy. Not bad, not unhappy, just adjusting. 11 men on a property are used to things being a certain way, and 9 children change all of those ways at once. There was a period of about 2 weeks where every meal was slightly tense, where the hands ate quietly and watched the children out of the corners of their eyes like they were trying to figure out what kind of weather had moved in. Gus, who had been king of the kitchen for 11 years, went through something I can only describe as a grieving process, as Nora quietly reorganized everything he'd ever put in a cabinet. The twins were the first to crack any of the hands. They found an old rope someone had left coiled on a fence post and turned it into something I never quite followed the rules of, and roped one of the younger hands, Teague, who was maybe 20 and had a good nature, around the ankles. And instead of being mad, Teague had laughed so hard he'd had to sit down. And after that, the ice was mostly gone. Nora ran the house the way I run the ranch. She knew where everything was inside of a week. She knew the names of all 11 hands inside of 2. She had a policy with the children that they were to stay out of the work areas of the ranch unless invited, and she enforced it the way you enforce something when you mean it. Not with a lot of words, just with the clear expectation that the rule was the rule. They were good children. They were tired, the way children are when they have moved through loss and upheaval, and they were watchful, and they tested things the way children always test things when they are figuring out what the new world holds. I was not sure how to be around them at first. I had not spent time with children in a long time. My brother had 3 back in Missouri, and I saw them every 4 or 5 years, and they were always at some age I didn't quite understand, old enough to talk, but too young to talk about anything I knew how to talk about. These 9 were different ages and different temperaments and different needs, and I was honest with myself. I didn't know what to do. What I did was what I know how to do. I showed them things. I showed the older boys how I walked a fence line and what I looked for. I showed Robert and Ray, who, it turned out, had more energy than any 2 full-grown men I'd ever hired, how to read a horse's feet, because it seemed like information that might redirect their attention from other, more destructive activities. The younger ones just wanted to be near things, the way young ones do, so I let them be near things. Lily, the 2-year-old, went through a period of about 3 weeks where she would follow me around the yard at whatever pace she could manage on her short legs, not saying anything, just going wherever I went. I don't know what she thought she was doing. I didn't ask. I just slowed down a little so she could keep up. Nora saw that. I didn't know she saw it until later. There was an evening in December. Snow had come down heavy that day, and by 4 o'clock everything was buried a foot deep and the sky was still going. The hands were in the bunkhouse. The horses were in. The children were inside. The little ones fed and in bed. The older ones at the long table in the kitchen where Celia was going through schoolwork with the middles. Something she'd taken on herself because there was no school close enough to matter in winter. I came in from the barn about 7:30, stamped my boots, hung my coat. The house was warm and it smelled like the bread Nora had baked that morning and lamp oil and the wood fire, and all of it smelled like a house that was being lived in. I don't know how else to say it. It's the difference between a barn and a stable, if you know what I mean. One is just kept, the other one is cared for. She was at the kitchen table when I came in. Most of the children had gone up by then. Celia was putting books away, gave me a nod, went upstairs. Nora was sitting with a cup of something and the household accounts in front of her, doing what she did most evenings, going over what had been spent, what was needed, where things could be stretched. She managed that household like a foreman manages a crew. Better, actually. My household expenses had gone down in 6 weeks, which I mentioned to Cal and which he thought was funnier than I'd intended. I poured myself a cup, sat down across from her. She didn't look up right away. She had a way of finishing a thought before she acknowledged you that I had gotten used to. She said the Hendersons up the road have a boy sick with something. I told Clara Henderson I'd take food tomorrow. I said that's fine. She said I'll need the small wagon if the snow holds. I said I'll have Teague clear the south lane in the morning. She made a mark in the ledger, then she looked up. She said, Aldous, I've been wanting to ask you something. I said, ask. She said, why aren't you married? I said, never found the right woman, I suppose. She said, you had 12,000 acres at 54, and no one was interested. I said it was more that I wasn't very interesting myself. She looked at me like she was checking to see if I was joking. I wasn't joking, and she could tell. She said, "You're interesting to my children." I didn't know what to say to that. I looked down at my cup. She said, "Lily follows you everywhere. Robert and Ray would work this ranch till midnight if you let them. Even Celia, and Celia is 17 and does not impress easy. Celia said you were fair." She said it like it surprised her, like fairness was something she'd had to learn to look for. I said, "They're good children." She said yes, they are. They've been through a hard thing. The fire popped. Outside, the snow was still coming down. You could hear it in the way the wind didn't quite make it through the walls. She said Tom was a good man. He wasn't a capable man, maybe. He tried things and they didn't go, but he was good. I said I know he was. She said I didn't think anybody'd want us. After 9 children it's a lot. I knew it was a lot. I wasn't asking anyone to take it on. I wasn't looking for anyone to. I said, "Nora." She looked at me. I said, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this out of pity. I'm not doing it because I feel sorry for you or because I think you need rescuing. I came out to your kitchen that morning because I looked at what Vaich was about to do and I couldn't stand to let it happen, because it wasn't right, and because—" I stopped. She waited. She was good at waiting. Not the waiting of someone who has nothing to say, the waiting of someone who is giving you room. I said, "Because you struck me as a woman worth knowing. Even then, with the deed on the table and the lamp almost out and everything sitting on you at once. You struck me as steady, in a way I respected." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's the nicest thing anybody's said to me in a long time." She said it simple, without fuss. And then she went back to the ledger, and I sat there with my cup and the snow outside and the house warm around us, and I thought, this is the thing I didn't know I was building toward, not the acres, not the herd, this. January. I won't tell the whole winter. It was a long one, and some parts of it are just ours, not for the telling. I'll say this. By the time the snow broke in late February, I had learned the names of all 9 children, not just as names, but as who they were. Celia, who was serious and capable and read every book in my library, and brought them back with small, careful notes on the flyleaves in pencil. Henry, 15, who had his father's trouble with starting things and his mother's stubbornness about finishing them. The twins, who were chaos in boots but who worked hard when the work was real, and they could see why it mattered. James, 9, who was quiet in a way that made you check on him and always turned out to be fine just thinking. Me, 7, who talked enough for all of them. Peter, 5, and Owen, 4, who were inseparable and seemed to operate on a private system of communication that I never cracked. And Lily, who by March had started calling me something that was not my name, and not any word I recognized, but which she used consistently, and with evident purpose. I didn't talk to Nora about what I was feeling. Not in those months. It wouldn't have been right. She was finding her footing and her children were finding theirs, and I didn't want to tip anything. What I did was what I'd always done. I worked. I showed up. I did what needed doing. If a child needed something, I tried to see to it. If Nora needed something, supplies, a hand fixed, a conversation with one of the hands sorted out, I dealt with it. Not to impress her. Just because it was my house and she was in it, and that was what you did. But there was an evening in March, mud season, when Henry had come back from a ride without the horse. He'd gone into a draw he didn't know, and the horse had gone through ice into a creek and come out lame, and Henry had walked 5 miles back in frozen boots. And the boy was 17, but he was pale and shaking and trying not to show it. I got his boots off and got him close to the fire and sent one of the hands for the horse and made him drink something hot. And the whole time I was aware of Nora on the other side of the kitchen, not interfering, just present. The way a woman is present who knows when to step back and when to step in. When Henry was warm and the color was back in his face and he'd started to be slightly embarrassed about the whole thing, which was a good sign, I went to the counter to refill the kettle. Nora was there. She put her hand on my arm, just for a moment, not a grab, not a clutch. Just her hand on my forearm, and she looked up at me and she said, quiet, so only I could hear it, she said, "Thank you, Aldous." I said, "He's all right." She said, "I know, thank you anyway." And she went back to the stove, and I stood there with the kettle in my hand and thought, so that's how this goes. The spring gathered itself the way it always does, slow, then all at once. The snow went, the mud came, the mud went, and the grass came, green in a way that always surprised me no matter how many years I watched it happen. The creek ran high. The calving started. Nora's children learned the ranch the way children learn a place they're going to keep, by running it until it was theirs. The twins were on horses most of the day once school let out, and I told Cal to find real work for them, and he did. And they rose to it, the way boys do when somebody gives them a real job and means it. Celia began to help Nora with the accounts in the afternoons. Henry, once he'd gotten over the draw incident, turned out to have his mother's eye for what needed doing. He'd see something that needed fixing and fix it without being asked, which is a quality worth more than most. And I was happy. I say that plainly because I am not a man who throws the word around and I want it to carry its weight. I was happy in a way I had not been for a long time, maybe not since the very beginning of the ranch when everything was still being made and every day was a thing being built. The house was full. The work was good. I was not alone. Nora and I did not talk about the future. We didn't need to, not yet. There was too much present to tend to, but I was aware of it building. I was aware of the specific pleasure of coming in from a long day and knowing she would be there. Of the way the house ran better than it ever had. Of the way the children had begun, quietly, without fuss, the way children do these things to treat my house like their house. In May, I rode the south fence with Robert and Ray, who were old enough and steady enough to be useful on a real ride now, and about midday we stopped by the creek and ate the food Nora had packed, and the boys, 12 years old, their father 8 months gone, asked me what it had been like when I first came to the land. I told them, not all of it, the parts that mattered. The bad boots and the letter from Cheyenne and the first winter when the creek froze and 2 horses died, and I thought I'd made a mistake I couldn't undo. The boys listened with the intensity of young men who are trying to understand how a man is built. I told them that the land took a long time to be yours, that you had to put so much in before it gave anything back, that most men quit before it turned, that the ones who didn't quit, they weren't necessarily the strongest. They were just the ones who had decided. Ray said, decided what? I said that they were going to stay, that's all, that they were going to stay and keep at it. He thought about that, then he said, like Mama. I said, yes, like your mama. I asked Nora in June. Not with any particular ceremony. I'm not a man for ceremony. It was evening, the kind of June evening that makes the whole year worth it, warm and still, the sky going pink over the ridge, the horses in the far pasture moving slow and easy, everything at peace with itself. We had walked out to the fence by the garden. She had put a kitchen garden in April, and it was coming up well. She walked it every evening, and we were standing there, and I had been thinking about asking for about 3 weeks, and I had decided that I kept not asking because I was waiting for the right moment, and there wasn't going to be a right moment, so this moment would have to do. I said, Nora. She said, I said, I'd like to marry you. She went very still. Then she turned and looked at me with that look, the measuring look, the creek in November look, and she said, is that so? I said, yes. She said, 9 children. I said, I know how many you have. She said, they're a lot of work. I said, I've noticed. She said, Lily still calls you something that isn't a word. I said, I've been meaning to ask you about that. The corner of her mouth moved, more than that first time, almost was becoming something else. She said, you sure about this, Aldous? I said, Nora, I have been sure about very few things in my life. This is one of them. She looked at me for a long time. The light was going pink and the horses were moving in the far field, and the garden was coming up all around us, and I stood there and waited, which was what she had taught me, not in words, just by doing it, that sometimes the right thing to do is give someone room. She said, yes, all right. She said it like she was also slightly surprised by herself, like she had expected to need more time and had found she didn't. And then she turned back to the garden and I stood beside her, and we looked at what was growing there in the June light, and she put her hand in mine, not a dramatic thing, just the quiet placement of her hand in my hand, easy and sure, like something that belonged, and we stood there until the pink went out of the sky. We married in August on the ranch. Cal stood up with me, Celia stood up with Nora. The preacher came from town, and the whole valley seemed to come with him. I hadn't expected so many people, and I don't think Nora had either. But they came. The families from every spread within 20 miles, and they brought food, and they were glad, genuinely glad. And I understood something about a community that I had maybe missed in my years of living apart from one. That when a good woman finds a solid place, and a quiet man finally fills the house he's been holding empty, It is something people want to celebrate. The twins wrestled two of the younger hands during the reception. I'm not sure who started it. Nobody got hurt. Lily wore a white dress that Nora had made her and fell asleep against my shoulder about 45 minutes in. And I stood there with a sleeping 2-year-old against my shoulder, and a cup in my other hand and my wife talking to one of the neighboring women across the yard. And Cal came and stood beside me and said, not looking at me, "How'd you get here?" I said, "Rode in on the gray." He said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I rode out to look at a fence line." He shook his head. He didn't say anything else. I am telling this from a long way on, 15 years near enough. I am 69 years old and Nora is 53, and the ranch is still here and still going. Celia married a good man from up near the territorial border and has 2 children of her own. Henry runs the south portion of the land. I gave it to him. He earned it. The twins, who are 27 and still match fence posts, have their own outfit 12 miles east that they built with their own hands and their mother's stubbornness, and I won't pretend I'm not proud of them because I am. The younger ones are grown or growing. Owen and Peter work the home ranch with me and Cal, who is still here and still says less than he means. Lily is 17 now. She hasn't called me by her made-up words since she was about 4, which honestly I miss a little. She is serious and dark-haired and looks like her mother and reads like Celia and can outride half the hands, which she is very calm about. She still walks with me when I do the evening check. We don't say much. We don't need to. The note is still somewhere. The original, the deed, the crumpled one with the coffee ring and the flower smear. Nora kept it. I don't know why she kept it, and she has never said, and I have never asked, but it is in the drawer of her desk in the room she uses for the accounts, and every few years I see it there when I'm looking for something else, and I take it out and hold it for a moment. Think about a woman alone at a table with a lamp going low. Think about a man who saddled a horse before he'd quite decided why. That's the thing about a decision that changes your life. You make it before you know you're making it. You think you're going to look at a fence line, and you end up in a kitchen, and everything after that is different. I don't know what I'd have become if I hadn't ridden west that morning. An old man in a big house, probably. 12,000 acres and nobody to show them to. All that work built into a thing that echoed when you walked through it. Instead, I came home last evening, came in from the south pasture where Owen and I had been working a section of fence that the winter had pushed over. And the kitchen was loud with something. An argument or a game, hard to tell in this house. And it smelled like whatever Nora was cooking, and the wood smoke and the horses I'd tracked in on my boots. And Nora was at the stove with her back to me, and she heard the door and she said, without turning around, "Wipe your boots." I wiped them. She turned then and looked at me, just looked. The way she has looked at me for 15 years, through everything, the good years and the hard ones, the winter we lost half the south herd and the spring we got it back. The years of raising 9 children and the different kind of quiet as they left one by one for their own lives. She looked at me the way she looked that first morning in her kitchen, with that measuring gaze, that creak in November depth. Except now what I see there is not the wariness of a woman trying to figure out what I want. It is the look of a woman who has already figured it out, a long time ago, and found it sufficient. She said, "You're late." I said, "Fence ran long." She said, "Owen told me." She said it without blame, just accounting for it. I crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the stove. She let me. She handed me the spoon like it was just part of the sequence of things that happen in an evening, like a gear turning into another gear. I stirred what was in the pot. Outside, through the window, the light was going, the long, slow going of a summer evening, pink at the rim of the hills and blue above it, and the first star not quite showing yet. She leaned against me for a moment, just that. Her shoulder against my arm, her weight real and familiar, 15 years of real and familiar. I thought about what I'd told the twins by the creek all those years ago, about staying, about how it wasn't about being the strongest. It was about deciding you were going to stay and keep at it. I put my arm around her. She stayed. That's the whole of it, that's all it ever was.